family business. We're research fellows at the Institute for Family Studies and affiliate scholars at an organization called the Institute for American Values. And we are currently writing a book on how working class young adults ages 19 to 35 are forming relationships in families and thinking about marriage. And we talk to young adults in the southwestern Ohio area. And we're going to talk this morning about marriage, and particularly how marriages and families are suffering in many places, especially in poor working class communities in America, and then think a little bit about what we can do about that.
And one way of thinking about the work that we do is that it deals with the demand side of abortion. Because if we have stronger marriages, stronger families, then we would think that there would be less demand for abortion. Because 85% of abortions happen to single women. So this makes it all the more troubling that, as sociologist Brad Wilcox put it, and you can actually go to the next slide to see the stats, that marriage seems to be disappearing from middle America, which he defines as the almost 60% of Americans who have high school education, but, okay, you can click for information. The almost 60% of Americans who have high school education, but no four-year college degree. So about 70% of high school educated women have had a child outside of marriage, 70%. So this isn't just some small, sub-segment of the population. This is actually the new normal in America, having a child outside of marriage. So you can see that reducing that number might mean reducing the number of abortions.
So what does this mean? What does it mean to strengthen marriage? And you can click here. It's a term that we throw around a lot, but what does it really mean? And to help us think about this question, we're going to tell you about a couple that we met through our research, Austin and Cassie. We made up their names to protect their identity. Though their story might sound kind of crazy to some of you, the themes it highlights are really typical of what we heard among the young people that we talked to. And then after we introduce Austin and Cassie to you, we'll go on to suggest some ideas for what strengthening marriage might look like. And finally, we'll tell you a little bit about one thing that we just started doing to help the post-divorce generation take back marriage.
So Cassie's mom was 17 when she found out that she was pregnant, and her family and her boyfriend's family wanted her to get an abortion. But she didn't want to, and so Cassie was born. Her parents married a few years later, and during her childhood, her dad worked as a mechanic and a truck driver, and her mom did like a secretarial job at a large international corporation. So they weren't poor, but they did usually live paycheck to paycheck, and the stresses of that and the stresses of having a child so young did make her parents' marriage somewhat unstable. They never divorced, but they often threatened to. The family was kind of nominally Baptist, and Cassie today would identify as Baptist, but she says that she says there's just a few rules I don't follow, things like having sex before marriage and that kind of thing. So one of Cassie's most formative experiences happened in high school when she would get made fun of a lot by the more affluent students in her school because of her weight, and also because the town that she came from was seen as white trash by a lot of her peers. So she remembers one time when she was warming up for a choir practice, and a student, just completely unprovoked, said to her, "Why don't you just go back to your box on the side of the highway? No one wants you." And so Cassie said that experiences like those hurt her deeply, and she says, I had no self-confidence, and she didn't have very many friends either.
And high school is where she met Austin, whom she began dating her senior year of high school. And Austin was carrying his own wounds. When he was a child, his dad cheated on his mom, divorced her, and then ended up marrying another woman, had a child with her, and then cheated on that woman as well. Austin's mom remarried, but Austin remembers watching as his stepdad stood in the kitchen yelling at his mom, being very verbally abusive, his mom in tears. And one time, Austin just got so angry, he couldn't stand to see his mom being treated this way. So he told his dad to shut up. He ripped him over the counter and shoved him through the wall and told him to get out. Austin's little brother called the cops, and Austin's mom filed for divorce. And when we met Austin's mom, she said simply, "Men suck." I mean, she was very, her experiences had just jaded her. So, and then Austin struggled with behavioral problems in high school, and so the principal sent him to an alternative school. And in his senior year, his mom was not doing well financially. She was on the verge of foreclosure. So Austin dropped out of school and got a job, $7 an hour job, at a fast food sandwich shop where his mom worked. Now, according to Austin, he was only 11 years old the first time he had sex. Several girlfriends would cheat on him in the next few years. Like the time he was dating his buddy's sister, whom he met at church when he was 16. One night, Austin wanted to surprise her and showed up at her house unannounced. He walked through the front door and found her on a couch sleeping with another boy. So, after several of these instances of cheating, Austin adopted a strategy of self-protection. He says, quote, "I let myself get close, but not too close, to where if it came down to it and I had to separate from him, I couldn't do it. I kept myself with some distance in the relationship."
And after high school, Cassie went through a period of partying and drinking and a few one-night stands, but eventually her relationship with Austin, which had been a little bit off and on, did get serious enough that Austin hatched a plan to propose. But Cassie's parents actually broke off the relationship before he could do that, mainly because they didn't like Austin because he smoked pot and just didn't seem like a responsible kid. So in the course of the next year, Cassie started dating an old friend, and he proposed, they planned a wedding, and then on her birthday, he broke off the engagement. She was devastated, and 3 months later, her grandma, who was her absolute best friend in the world, she would go over there after her late night shifts and sit with her grandma, and they would drink coffee and play cards all night long. But her grandma passed away 3 months after her engagement was broken off. So Cassie became depressed and had a lot of questions for God, stopped going to church, and one day at 21 years old, when she was alone in her parents' kitchen, she just started cutting herself. She said that the pain of that made the pain from everything else seem like it went away, at least momentarily. So she remembers sitting there while her mom was at work in the kitchen, cutting herself deeply and just watching the blood come out. She just didn't care anymore.
About a year after that happened, she was at a funeral, Cassie was. She felt a tap on her shoulder, she turned around, and there was Austin. They agreed to meet that night at a restaurant. They got back together immediately, and they moved in together the next day, to the livid objections of Cassie's parents, of course. About a week later, after they reunited, they were watching the movie Avatar when Cassie turned to Austin and asked, "What would you do if we got married and had a child?" "What would you do if I tell you I'm already planning it?" was Austin's response. He said he had been hoping to get her pregnant ever since that first night that they reunited. About 3 months into the relationship, Cassie found out she was pregnant, and they were both very happy. About 4 months into the relationship, they got married on a sunny day under a park pavilion. Some friends of theirs had warned them that they were rushing too fast, and they encouraged them to take it slower, but Austin and Cassie didn't see it that way.
Right.
They knew they wanted to be together for life, they were having a baby, and they wanted to be a family together. They loved each other, and that was all that mattered, they said. As Cassie said, quote, "With marriage, there's more of a special bond than there is just being together. I'm going to be with him for the rest of my life, and I won't ever lose him." Basically, you become the same person, as the Bible says. Two become one, with a unity candle and all that, end quote. So about 30 guests were at their wedding, including Austin's divorced parents and a set of divorced grandparents on each side. We were also there. We were the designated videographers. And as we went from guest to guest, we expected people to give their well wishes and advice to the young, happy couple. Instead, we got mostly awkward pauses, downward shifting glances, and kind of like silence. It was very, very awkward. One of those awkward things I think we've ever encountered.
Holding the camera.
Yeah, like we went up to Austin's divorced grandma and we just asked her, do you have anything to tell the newly happy couple, the newly married couple? She said, I don't know what to tell them. When Austin's dad didn't say anything, we had the camera on him, another woman just said, run. Another person said, he's got the ball and chain already on his leg, should have ran away. It was not the well wishes and good advice we had been expecting.
So after the wedding, Austin and Cassie moved in with his mom. They had been planning to move into a trailer in a trailer park nearby, and they had lined it up, but they just couldn't get the money that they needed for that initial down payment, and so it didn't work out. And Cassie kind of suspected that maybe Austin was wasting their money on pot, and that's why they didn't have enough money to move into the trailer like they had hoped. But in Austin's defense, because he's adamant that he wasn't, their budget was tight. So Cassie worked at a receptionist at a car dealership for $8 an hour, part-time, and Austin also was working part-time at the sandwich shop for $7 an hour. And after they got married, his manager cut his hours even further, saying that they were spending too much on labor. So Austin got another job delivering newspapers, but still, he was just making like $250 a week. So within about 2 months, Austin and Cassie they got into an argument. Neither of them remembers what the argument was about, but it was big enough to cause them to separate. Cassie went back, lived with her parents for a while, but then she and Austin got back together and moved in with his mom again. Or no, actually, Austin moved in with her family. And then on the day when she had her 20-week ultrasound, and they found out they were having a baby girl, her boss called and said that she was fired. Apparently there had been a lot of customer complaints, although she had never been told about any of them and there was no documentation of any of them. She suspects that they just didn't want to give her the 12 weeks of maternity leave that she would need to have. We don't really know the full story there, but so she has no job now. So all of this is, additional stress on what is already a fragile marriage. And
another thing was, ever since their wedding day, Cassie had become increasingly annoyed at Austin's paranoid behavior. She'd be looking at her texts and he'd be like, who's texting you? He was afraid that one of her exes was texting him and trying to get back together with her. He was, by his own admission, he was struggling with what he called trust issues. He said, talking about his girlfriends that he's had, when I don't know where they are or what they're doing, it literally feels like someone's taking a stake and driving it into my chest. That's how I feel every time, no matter how hard I try to put it out of my mind. He explained to me that he had 37 girlfriends. He's 20 years old at the time, and all of them had cheated on him except for 2. I was a little bit startled by this. I said, wait a minute, what do you mean by cheated? And he went on to explain, yes, cheated like having sex, and the whole cheated. So, yes, he's going to have some trust issues.
So to make an already long story shorter, Austin and Cassie had a big fight one night in front of Walmart, and Cassie called it quits on the marriage. Her mom had always told her, if I ever woke up next to your father and just couldn't stand him, I would divorce him that day. So, Cassie kind of adopted that attitude, and 4 months into their marriage, Cassie could not stand Austin. She didn't trust that he would be a responsible father, and he was proving to not be a responsible husband. At the time, Cassie was about 6 months pregnant, and by the time she was 8 months pregnant, she was dating somebody else who was there at her side at the hospital when she had a C-section. He had the scrubs and slippers over his cowboy boots, and he was the first one to give the baby her bottle, rock her in the nursery. And Cassie was just desperately trying to forget the baby's real father, so she had been calling him Daddy from basically their first conversation. She had asked him, would you feel comfortable, even before they were dating, if we ever get together, would you feel comfortable being my baby's dad? So from the beginning, this is what she was thinking. And she wanted to do everything that she could to keep Austin out of their daughter's life.
So that's Austin and Cassie's story. During the course of one pregnancy, we watched them get married, separate, get back together, get divorced, and Cassie get back together with a different person. So when thinking about couples like Austin and Cassie, and young couples like them, again, this is not the craziest story we heard. What does strengthening marriage look like? And think of Austin and Cassie, especially before they got married. What should they have done? And what could have helped them? One possible response to Austin and Cassie's story is to say, the culture is so screwed up and sending up such screwed up messages to young people that the world's just going to hell in a handbasket and it's just going to get worse before it gets better. But Pope Francis has been warning Catholics, especially but all of us as Christians, about this kind of response to contemporary social problems, the kind of response that kind of maybe looks to a haloed past or to the distant future and just laments the current culture. He says, Pope Francis has really been challenging us. What is God doing today? And I want to quote from him. He says, and this is from an interview he gave to the Jesuit Journal, quote, "I have a dogmatic certainty. God is in every person's life. God is in everyone's life. Even if the life of a person has been a disaster, even if it is destroyed by vices, drugs, or anything else, God is in this person's life. You must try to seek God in every human life. Although the life of a person is a land full of thorns and weeds, there is always a space in which the good seed can grow. You have to trust God." So I think what Pope Francis is proposing there is that we not just remain on the defense, but that we go on the offense, daring to ask in the messy stories of people like Cassie and Austin, where is God? Where is there an opening? Where is there a spot that we can build a bridge into their lives? Pope Francis talks about, the quote is, he talks about accompanying people starting from their situation. And he talks about being, quote, missionary disciple, whatever we do.
So at some point in the course of our interviews that we were doing for the book that we're writing, we started to get to know people better, and some of them even became friends. Cassie is one of them. She's a dear friend, comes over for dinner at least once a month. But through that experience of actually getting to know people in a more personal way, Pope Francis's words about going to the margins and being a faithful presence there really began to resonate with us. We began to see that the only way to really reverse the cycle of family fragmentation and distrust is to acknowledge and enter into each other's sufferings. Programs and educational classes and even cultural messages, all of these are very important, but they're not the most needful thing. The greatest need is really for missionary disciples, like Pope Francis talks about, who are present in the lives of people who are experiencing suffering in their family lives. But what might it look like to be a missionary disciple when it comes to strengthening marriage? Well, we have 4 things that we'd like to propose.
And you can click on the PowerPoint here. The first thing is, let's think holistically about strengthening marriage. I think sometimes those of us who care about marriage, we sometimes talk so much about the importance of getting married and pointing out the benefits that are generally associated with marriage as opposed to, for instance, cohabiting, that we forget about all the things that happen before marriage and outside of marriage that affects the relationship if they get married. For instance, Austin and Cassie, they got married, but they weren't adequately prepared for marriage. They were rushing into sex and living together. And also the issue here is deeper than just marriage prep classes, as important as those are, because the best marriage prep really happens over the course of one's childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, and not just in the immediate period before the wedding. We all know that. But it's because Austin and Cassie, they were carrying deep wounds into their relationship from their family of origins and their childhood.
Never got dealt with.
And Austin, he's angry at his dad, and he has difficulty trusting women. And additionally, Marriage and any healthy romantic relationship, really, it requires a certain level of self-mastery and some kind of basic character traits. It doesn't require perfection, of course, but it does require, I think, a certain kind of level of basic self-mastery. And many young people today are just simply not equipped with that. In part, I think, because of the legacy of divorce and family fragmentation. We have to talk about that. We have to. And of course, as I said, also in Cassie, they did rush into sex and living together. And they have also these kind of toxic beliefs about love, that it just kind of happens and that they'll stay in love. Their ideas about love have little to do with the will and all that. So that's an important part here too. And beyond that, they had little social capital or social support. No one from their families was saying, why don't you go to marriage counseling? So I think it's really important that we think about marriage holistically. And we like to think of it as, let's think of the whole marriage ecology. If you think of it this way, if you want to sustain the endangered bog turtle species, we don't just take individual bog turtles and give them healthy food. You have to create a sustainable habitat for the bog turtle species to survive.
Right.
In the same way, marriage is endangered in many poor and working class neighborhoods because the marriage habitat, material and cultural, has become toxic. And so we can't, in that kind of toxic environment, it won't be sufficient to just tell individual couples like Austin and Cassie to get married. We have to address the habitat that it takes for the married species to thrive. Now, what is a marriage ecology? Something we've been thinking about. We think it includes at least three things at a minimum. It includes a lot of things, I'm sure, but at least three things. One, the beliefs and attitudes about marriage, happiness, love, and work. Beliefs and attitudes, those are extremely important. But then also, the civil society institutions like the church that transmit, and the family, that transmit those attitudes. And also the economic institutions that practically enable people to have a basic level of stability and dignity. I think those three things are, at a minimum, are a part of that. So I think when we talk about strengthening marriage, we have to talk about everything from rehabilitating chastity to providing young people a just wage that enables them to provide for their families.
You can go ahead and click to the next slide. The second point, we want to think about marriage strengthening is that we need to acknowledge the deep suffering that is often present in the lives of people who are cohabiting, having kids outside of marriage, or divorced. Sometimes we're so focused on, the fact that this person had a kid outside of marriage or is rushing into sex that we forget the profound wounds that people are carrying with them. And of course, this doesn't excuse people's action, but it does require us to act with compassion and understanding.
Right.
So as one child of divorce put it, I don't want my kids to have to go through a lot of the things that I went through, because I don't think it's fair, for one, because it's hard. You gotta grow up really quick. It's not always the best thing because you get into sex, you get into drugs. I feel like a lot of people that have had their parents stay together, they're more into sports, into education, more into those things. But we were just like, screw it. So this child of divorce kind of noticed this difference between people who are from intact families versus the way that he grew up. And so what Pope Francis said about the church as a field hospital is very relevant to this discussion about family fragmentation. And I'll quote him. He says, "I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugar.
Right.
You have to heal his wounds, and then we can talk about everything else."
Third thing, empower people, or honor the dignity of the person, and invite the person to contribute to the solution rather than just kind of thinking about offering a social service to poor people or delivering a message that we think they need to hear. The psychologist Dr. Bill Doherty put it this way. He said, quote, "The greatest untapped resource for our time is the knowledge, wisdom, and lived experience of families and their communities." And he says, quote, families must be engaged as producers and contributors to their communities, and not just as clients or consumers of services. Again, just think of divorce and what that young child of divorce, what he was talking about, all the hurt that he realized. You know, if you remember the 1970s, people were thinking about divorce might be a fine social experiment. People like Anthony, that child divorced, he knows better. He carries a knowledge that is vitally important. And we should invite people like him to apply that knowledge. And surveys consistently show that about 80% of young people, no matter the demographic, say that marriage, having a good marriage, is an important part of their life plan.
Absolutely.
So young adults want to get married. It's just that they don't know how to get there. So tapping into the untapped resource that Doherty mentions is a step, I think, in the direction of helping young adults to achieve their marriage aspirations.
And then lastly, invite into community. So everybody wants rich friendship and a vibrant community, but when it comes to marriage, there's this problem. People tend to think of themselves as lone rangers. So for example, Anthony, who we mentioned earlier, he's concerned about divorce and these marriage trends that he sees, but he says, I don't think there's anything we can do about it. And that's just kind of the American way. This is a free country and free this and free that. But it's your life, and not too many people care about other people's lives. As long as it's not theirs, they don't care. That's what he perceives other people to be thinking.
So sad.
And so it's this idea that your relationship, your marriage is your own private business. And it's a sentiment we heard over and over again in our interviews. We asked people a question about advice, like what advice have you been given, or what advice would you give to others? And most people said, oh, I don't give advice, or I don't take advice, or I haven't really heard advice. You know, it's just this belief that you have to learn it on your own, make your own mistakes. So young adults feel alone, even as they are sharing these common struggles. So we have to help people break through that attitude to move from being strangers to being in solidarity, and to recognize that we can help each other through word and deed to reach these aspirations for lifelong love. But how, you might ask? How do we help people to think more intentionally about sex? How can they build trust in their dating relationships? How can they form good marriages? What does it look like to help each other in this most intimate area of life? So there's all sorts of possibilities, but we'd like to tell you about a project that we recently started with an organization called the Chiaroscuro Institute, which is based in DC. And about a year ago, they started a website called I Believe in Love. So you can actually click and you'll see a shot from the website. But they started this website as a website that is for young adults and written by young adults, and particularly young adults from this high school educated working class demographic that we've been focusing on today. So the idea is to change the current messaging about love and to inspire young adults to make better decisions in that area, to help them see that they're not alone in their struggles and in their aspirations. So the model is unique because it's inviting the same young adults that they're trying to reach out to. They're being invited to be paid contributors to the website and to share their stories there. So because writing can be such a transformative process, it makes you reflect on your own life in ways, and like to notice things that you might not have noticed before. That I think is why this is can be a powerful thing. So for example, Brittany, a writer there who's a single mom, she realized through the process of writing a story about her dating life that she was sleeping with guys way too quick. If she wanted a guy who was marriage material, she would need to slow down. And that's something that she had just always done, you know, ever since she was 15. She had always been dating somebody, and just writing it down, thinking about it, made her realize, oh, maybe this isn't the best strategy. And she says that she's never really talked to anybody else about relationships and these sorts of things. She doesn't have anybody to talk to about it. And so writing at I Believe in Love gives her a kind of outlet to sort out her thoughts, and a place where she can go and read about the experiences and reflections of other people.
And so, of course, you know, online is great and everything, but the folks who started I Believe in Love also recognize that if you want to sustain an authentic community, you have to be eventually you have to be physically present in each other's lives. So they invited us to start a pilot project that we just started this week, where we, in our mostly working class town, we're trying to connect. One, we're trying to build relationships with young people. Two, invite them to contribute to I Believe in Love. And then also connect them to thriving communities, like a mom's group at our church, or a father's group, or crisis pregnancy center if there's that need, or the career center if they're looking for a job. So connecting them to places where they can start to get their life on the right path. And really the idea is to, in our area, begin to think about what it means to have a thriving marriage ecology. And we would love any of y'all's ideas that you have about how you do that, and if you're interested in it. If we could partner with you in some way, we would love to talk about that. So I'll be here the rest of the day, we could talk about that. In closing, and our emails are on the screen there too. In closing, I think it is important to remember that whatever we do, that we can be missionary disciples when it comes to marriage and family. Think about the working class demographic, people who may not have seen many happily married couples in their lives. Who are those people in your life, and what can we do to invite them into our churches, into the places where we are meeting with other people? To paraphrase Pope Francis, even if a person's relationship and family life are full of thorns and weeds, seek out the space. Let's seek out the space in which the good seed can grow. Let's look for an opening and build a bridge. And with that, we'll take your questions.